chemicals. That word immediately comes with a feeling that people get. When they hear the word chemical, they immediately think bad. Oh no, not the chemicals. We can't get them inside us. They're going to poison us. Sometimes, but not always. A lot of the time, chemicals are needed. Like everything is a chemical, including the oxygen that you're breathing right now. That's a chemical that your body needs to sustain itself. Now, everything comes in different levels. Every chemical, like if we were to measure just our classroom, we could measure the amount of chemicals in the air. We could measure the amount of chemicals on the floor. We can measure the amount of chemicals in your body. Now, what we really want to find out is what is the most optimal amount of chemicals for whatever organism in question. Usually we're talking about humans, but also another big one is plants. Imagine growing some corn. Corn needs different chemical structure than flowers do, than just like your regular perennial flowers that you toss into your garden. They can't. They're not all born equal in the same way all animals aren't. As I'm sure you can tell, like a crab underneath the water probably needs different chemical structure than us living up on the ground, or birds that spend a lot of the time in either trees or in the air. So, different things required by different organisms. So, what we're going to be looking at is kind of like the Goldilocks principle, that chemicals, you don't want too little of it because that usually leads to some sort of starvation, some sort of nutrient deficiency that can be degenerative, or it can be harmful to the organism. Usually you need at least a little bit of almost everything. The other side of it is that you can have too much of something, and that leads to poisoning. Almost anything will poison you. You can get water poisoning if you have too much water, and obviously we need a lot of water, but if you drink too much water, you can kill yourself from water. So we want, like I said, it's like a Goldilocks principle. We want to find the balance. We don't want too little, we don't want too much, we want just right. Every animal has a different just right, and that's to look at their tolerance. Some animals can accept a wide range of chemical levels in their environment and still keep on trucking. Other organisms need an extremely specific amount of chemicals in their environment, or else they die. So that's where we generally start looking at generalist organisms and specialist organisms. Generalists are ones that can kind of just do anything, kind of survive almost no matter what. The tardigrade, my favorite little critter, this is like the ultimate generalist. We have tried to do everything to this animal and it still keeps on living. The tardigrade, the little water bear, and we've even put this sucker in outer space and it still kept living. So the ultimate generalist. And then there's other organisms like certain flowers. Like you add a little bit of acidity into your garden by accident and your flowers all die. Like they're a little bit more of a specialist. They need certain conditions. If it frosts, if it gets too cold, they die. So generalists and specialists. Everything needs different levels of chemicals. Specifically, the chemical levels that we're going to be looking at is like the amount of oxygen, the amount of acidity, the amount of dissolved nutrients in either the soil or the water. Most organisms either live near or on soil, or near or in water. And then the other side of the bad ones, like pollutants and insecticides and pesticides and herbicides, fungicides, the things that we spray on our farms to and our land to keep the stuff we don't want in there. So, chemical levels, let's dive into some specifics. So let's start with oxygen. That's kind of a key one for us. Oxygen, it doesn't really have an upper limit for at least humans that we can't really surpass. Like you can breathe in 100% oxygen, like putting on an oxygen mask, and like from running too much to like see how much oxygen you can pump in, get your oxygen levels nice and high. Like it's 100% oxygen. Like it's okay to breathe in. Now, having too much oxygen in the air increases the risk of an explosion. Oxygen being one of the key components to starting a fire, but that's not really something we're too worried about, because like we're talking about chemical levels in the body. Now, when we're talking oxygen, we definitely got to talk about low levels of oxygen. It doesn't take much to lower the oxygen content in the air, and suddenly bad things start happening to humans really quickly. At zero oxygen level, in the case of like drowning or suffocation, it doesn't take long in an organism like us. 5 minutes is kind of the upper limit before things are irreversible. So the oxygen being a really important key component to our bodies, it needs to be at least a certain level. Our oxygen content in the air, the one that we are pretty happy with, is 21%. We can go lower than that by a few percent, but not very far. Once you start getting around the 16% level, the 12% level, like you start having bad effects on the brain, and then eventually like passing out, much lower than that, and you're like actually gonna die real quick. Oxygen content is a really important part in an organism's body. Another important chemical level to be very considerate of is acidity. Now, we're going to actually talk about acids and bases later in this unit, so you'll learn a little bit more about what acids are. But just from your prior knowledge, you already know things like acid rain. Acids do some bad stuff. Now, not all acids are bad. Again, we're all looking for that certain level that is optimal. And for most organisms, it's a little bit on the acidic side. So a little bit of acid's actually good. Now, too much acid is obviously a bad thing. Too much acid becomes corrosive, the point where you kind of like you put your hand in there and you take your hand out and it's like part of my hand is missing. That's really, really, really strong acids though. But anyway, acidity, we actually use that as a defense mechanism in our body. Like your stomach is full of acid, that doesn't break down your food. Like the hydrochloric acid in your stomach, the purpose of it isn't to break down your food. It's to kill bacteria and fungus and other like eggs and stuff from parasites and insects that when you eat those by accident, or like it's inevitable when you eat food, there's going to be bacteria and fungus and other things on it. When you eat that and it goes into your stomach, you have a defense. Like that acid is strong enough, it's a strong acid to kill those organisms. So acids, again, it's all about a balance. You need a little bit, you need in certain places, you need a lot in other places. Different organisms have different tolerance for it. There's some cool spruce that live in marshes that actually, when they shed their needles, the needles actually, when they decay, they release acid into the area. They actually acidify the soil, with a cool purpose being like they're the only ones that can live in acidic soil, in fairly acidic soil. So they actually kind of create a monopoly on the soil that they live in. It's like, okay, this is all mine, and oh, you want to start growing? Too bad, have my acid needles. And they're pretty cool. So acid, different animals, different tolerance, different likes and dislikes, but acid in general, it's a good thing in small amounts, and again, it's all about the levels. Acid rain obviously contributes to higher acidity in an area. Like when we're concerned about acid rain, we're concerned about there developing too much acid, and then that can start having some pretty negative consequences. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later in the unit when we really start talking about pollution. Now, nutrients, things that we know that we have to have at least a little bit of, can also be bad in too high of quantities. Like if you eat too much sugar, it starts degrading your body. Like it's actually really unhealthy for your heart. Sugar in too high quantity, in too high amounts in small period of times. Like plants, they need certain nutrients, but so when you go to plant plants, you are obviously going to put some fertilizer in the soil to help it along, help it grow really fast and really well. But if you put too much fertilizer in the soil, you give them a type of burning that actually can kill them. Too much will actually straight up murder plants. Again, it's all about a certain amount of level. That's good. So you need certain, like the nutrients in soil and the nutrients in water needs to be kind of at again, that Goldilocks principle. You want a certain amount. Now, nutrients in water, they're just as important. Like, think about like organisms that live in water. Like, the main plant in water is algae. They can't deal with much acid. They can't deal with it almost at all. You add too much acidity to them, and the whole plant life inside of a lake or a pond or a river is gone. You strip away the plant source in an ecosystem, and that ecosystem is screwed. Like, they cannot survive. So likewise, all the insects in the pond will die, and then very quickly all of the fish and stuff will die. It's just this cascading effect of just bam, 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 and then gone. No different with us. If we mess up our plants, the primary eaters of those plants will go, and then we're right behind it. Now let's talk pollutants. There's also pollutants that can get into an area. We introduce some pollutants on purpose too. Like, for example, a pesticide. A pesticide is a chemical that we deliberately spray on plants with the intent of having just a small little poison on those plants, and then insects come along, they go to munch on our plants, because we want that corn. We don't want insects to eat that corn. So when they go to eat the corn, they take a small little bite, and there's enough poison in there that your little caterpillar goes, but there's nowhere near enough of that poison to harm us. So that's an insecticide, something that's harmful to smaller organisms, not even close to harmful to us. We deliberately spray that on almost every crop that you guys consume, unless, of course, you're consuming organic. So how do these chemicals actually get in us? There's a couple of different ways. First of all, there's your absorption and ingestion. Absorption is how those things get absorbed into your body, and it's more than just through breathing. Like, when you breathe in, a lot of chemicals are absorbed across your lung. That's kind of the key way that you absorb things, namely like oxygen and stuff. But other chemicals can be absorbed in other ways, namely through your skin. Surprisingly, that's one that people really don't consider. When they get chemical spills on like their hands and stuff, they'll gently wash it under the water for a couple seconds, and they're like, "Oh, I'm good." But really, that chemical is like, if you really don't get that off, that chemical slowly absorbs into your skin, and it enters your bloodstream, and that can be really bad. So absorption being a big one, but ingestion being probably the key one. When we want a chemical inside of us, namely food, that's the one we're mostly going for when we are ingesting things, hopefully. Then the ingestion being one of the key ones. So ingestion is actually consuming it, chewing it, swallowing it, getting inside your stomach. There you have nearly as direct a link to your bloodstream as like when you breathe in through your lungs. You're bringing those chemicals really close to your bloodstream inside of your intestines. So those chemicals get absorbed. Now, how they get absorbed is another question. So now we're going to talk about diffusion and osmosis. Diffusion is basically random chance. It's kind of a cool principle where there's more of something, it's more likely that concentration of stuff is going to move to a place where there's less. And again, it just basically boils down to chance. Diffusion is the process, like a definition for diffusion is the process of something moving from a high concentration to a low concentration. Eventually they even themselves out. And again, this is all because particles will naturally, they're just naturally vibrating. Everything has some level of heat, some amount of temperature. And because of that, they're vibrating. So that vibration can be in any direction. Now, if I have a whole bunch of something right here, and all those particles are randomly vibrating in any direction, there's a much higher chance that some of those particles will move over into the empty space than some of the smaller concentration particles will come over and join into the bigger piece. That's what I mean by random chance. It's just a probability thing. It's more likely that it's going to go from a high concentration to a low concentration. So when we look at it in the real world, that's what happens. Now, osmosis is a special type of diffusion. It's a type of diffusion relating specifically to water, how water diffuses across a semi-permeable membrane. So we're talking cells here. If we're going to talk about membranes, remember the membrane is the skin layer that goes around a cell. Diffusion is going to cause all sorts of chemicals to move across that membrane. Some can easily move across, others need help, and others can't move across, depending on their size. But water is a big one. Even cells need water. They need a lot of it too. So osmosis is all about the concentration of water, and it's the same principle as diffusion. Water will move from a high concentration to a low concentration. Where there's more water, it will move to where there's less. So it's all about the percentage of water. Here's where osmosis starts getting really interesting though. Because it's all about the percentage of water, if you can in some way lower the percentage of water in a certain area, you can actually cause more water to diffuse into that region. And you can actually end up with an imbalance of total water, but have a completely balanced proportional amount of water. So in other words, we could have like 500 water molecules on one side of the membrane and 10 water molecules on the other side, as long as the percentage of water is the same on both sides. And that's the beauty of osmosis. That's the beauty of a membrane, because on the inside of a cell, you can actually set up a situation where you flood an area with a whole bunch of things, like salt. You put a whole bunch of salt in a certain area, and by doing that, by introducing these salt particles, you are lowering the amount of total water. Like if you had 100% water, and then on the other side of the membrane you had a whole bunch of water with salt, well, that's actually a lower percentage of water. So the water is actually going to move from the 100% over into the salty water, and thereby increasing the amount of water inside of the cell. Even though the cell might have less water than the area surrounding it. Imagine that cell sitting inside of like a glass of water, 100% water all around it, but yet somehow the cell is filling up. So cells set up this imbalance by using transport. They can transport molecules, particles, into an area. They can use energy to push the particles into an area of higher concentration. They can push back against diffusion, the natural state of diffusion, where things will want to go from a high concentration to a low concentration. If you use active transport, you can actually push particles from a low concentration to a high concentration. So herein lies some key differences between diffusion, osmosis, and active transport, three modes of moving stuff around. Diffusion and osmosis both use no energy at all. They're just random chance. It's all based on proportions. And things will move from a high concentration to a low concentration. Active transport is kind of the opposite of that. It requires energy to move something from a low concentration into a high concentration. So continue making that concentration higher and higher. So, three different modes of moving things around, moving chemicals around. So let's summarize. Every organism requires different amounts of chemicals from their environment. Either too little of it, too much of it is a bad thing. You kind of want that Goldilocks region. You want that just perfect amount. And that goes for oxygen, nutrients, acidity, different types of pollutants. Like you can manage certain amounts of these things. Different organisms can tolerate going a little bit outside that range, but you go too far into the extremes and your likelihood of surviving starts dropping off pretty quickly. Like the example I gave with oxygen, once you get down below like 12%, you're looking at some pretty scary consequences very quickly. Then we also talked about how those nutrients and how those chemicals can move around your body, how they're absorbed and ingested, and how they move around once they're actually inside your body. And that is all to do with three modes of transport: your diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. Diffusion is the natural movement of things from a high concentration to a low concentration. Osmosis is specifically the diffusion of water across a membrane. And then finally, active transport is how organisms can use energy to actually go against that. They can use energy to pump from a low concentration into a high concentration, thereby being very different from diffusion and osmosis. It's kind of like the exact opposite of diffusion. It requires energy to move from low to high, whereas diffusion and osmosis both use no energy whatsoever, and they go from a high to a low. That's it for this one. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time.